This is Mr. Bell from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, Mayor, good to see you again. Attorney General Schwab, I want to extend my gratitude to your office. When I was prosecutor, we had a very tough case that actually involved a police officer defendant, and you all helped us work with the victim in that case to a resolution that both parties were happy with, particularly our victims, and I appreciate that. And so I have a couple questions that I want to talk about. One, I think a point needs to be made between the role of the National Guard and what they do and actual policing, and those are two different roles. And I think a lot of folks don't understand that difference. A 20-year-old with a gun in the military is taught how to kill. Police officers have to do a whole skew of things, including de-escalation. And so I think that it's important we talk about that. And so my first question, and I'm short on time. Mayor, you were asked a question about the resources and what you would do with those resources, and you were cut off. Could you quickly finish that answer? That was earlier.
The resources with regard to our budget?
Yes.
Yes. So in order to close the $1 billion gap, we looked across our government. So we had to cut citywide contracts related to everything from mental health services to the contracts to give our employees raises, most notably MPD and fire and EMS.
And so law enforcement would be included in that, obviously, and is a priority, but there's also other things that a mayor is responsible for.
Absolutely, including shifting spending that should have happened in 25 related to affordable housing.
Thank you, Mayor. And Attorney General, can you speak to how over-policing and temporary enforcement tactics have addressed or failed to address the root causes of crime in D.C.?
Well, as anybody in law enforcement knows and anybody prosecuting cases knows, the level of trust the community has with law enforcement is essential. We need witnesses to feel comfortable coming forward. We need victims to recognize that they can come forward. And that trust between law enforcement, our MPD, and communities all around our city is something that we have worked very hard as a city to build over time. But like so much, it can be broken very quickly. And I worry very much about the distrust that has been caused by the recent events to communities who worked very hard to trust their MPD and vice versa. And
I think people also have to understand the cost of sustaining the National Guard in a major city like D.C., or now we're hearing even in my hometown of St. Louis, is astronomical. To send our troops who are trained, who are supposed to be protecting the homeland, to be coming in and doing the policing work, when we could take a fraction of that cost, pennies on the dollar, invest that in local law enforcement who is actually trained, and give them the resources that they need and keep people safe for fractions of the cost. And so it's just interesting to me that my colleague would talk about defunding the police when the big ugly bill actually defunded the police. It cut funding for local law enforcement, and I don't hear my colleagues saying anything about that. And so also there were some, with respect to serious crimes, carjacking, I know that was an issue. What has D.C. been doing to address those issues?
Well, my office is prosecuting every case, every carjacking case, every armed carjacking case where we have sufficient evidence to meet our burden of proof. They are difficult cases to make from an evidentiary standpoint, from a witness perspective, and yet more than 84% of the cases that MPD brought to us of carjacking last year we prosecuted. So we need to hold young people accountable and make sure they face consequences when they're engaged in carjacking.
And Mr. Jackson, with the remainder of my time, thank you for the work that you do. Can you speak to strategies you have found to be the most effective in actually curbing recidivism rates in our juveniles?
Well, we know that one of the most important things you can do is invest in victim services for those who have been traumatized by violence. As I said before, there are 24 states suing the Trump administration for withholding $1 billion for victim service funds through the VOCA Act. But we know that the best way we can reduce violence and recidivism is by investing in those who are most at risk. and those who are most vulnerable, whether that's community violence intervention, victim services, mentorship programs, employment-based programs, all of which are under siege or have been cut by this administration.
Thank you. And with respect to victim services, I could not agree with you more. It's so important. Sometimes what gets lost in the argument is we do focus on arresting serious and violent offenders, which is so important, and also alternatives to incarceration for low-level offenders struggling with addiction and mental health. But we also got to be laser focused on our victims, and that impacts so many of our communities. I thank you, and I yield back.
During a House Oversight Committee hearing last week, Representative Wesley Bell, Democrat, Missouri, discussed the impact of cuts to local law enforcement funding in the Republican budget. He began by expressing his gratitude to Attorney General Schwab's office for their assistance in resolving a difficult case involving a police officer defendant, highlighting their work in helping the victim reach a resolution. Representative Bell then shifted focus to the role of the National Guard versus the responsibilities of local police officers. He emphasized that while National Guard members are trained primarily for combat, police officers must handle a wide array of responsibilities, including de-escalation and community engagement. Bell stressed the importance of understanding the distinct roles of these two entities. Turning to budgetary concerns, Bell noted that the city of St. Louis had faced a billion-dollar gap in its budget, leading to tough decisions. He explained that cuts were made across the board, affecting various services, including mental health contracts and raises for city employees, notably those working in law enforcement, emergency services, and other sectors. Bell acknowledged that local law enforcement was a priority, but also emphasized the broader responsibilities a mayor must manage, such as shifting funds initially allocated for affordable housing. Bell then asked the mayor to finish a response about how resources would be allocated to address the budget gap. The mayor clarified that the city had been forced to cut citywide contracts, including those for crucial services like mental health, while also reducing funding for employee raises. He noted that despite these cuts, law enforcement remained a top priority for the city, even as other vital services were impacted. Attorney General Schwab spoke about the consequences of over-policing and temporary law enforcement tactics in Washington, D.C. He explained that trust between law enforcement and the community is essential for effective policing. Schwab noted that the recent events had caused a significant erosion of trust, particularly among communities that had worked hard to build a positive relationship with the police. He also discussed the high costs of deploying the National Guard for policing duties and suggested that investing those funds in local law enforcement, who are better trained for such tasks, would be a more cost-effective and efficient approach. Representative Bell criticized the notion of defunding the police, pointing out the irony that the very legislation some referred to as defunding the police had in fact reduced funding for local law enforcement. He called attention to the contradiction and questioned why more attention wasn't being paid to the cuts that were harming law enforcement resources. The conversation then turned to the issue of carjackings in Washington, D.C. Schwab reported that his office was prosecuting every case involving carjackings, including armed carjackings, whenever sufficient evidence was available. He acknowledged the difficulty of these cases, given the challenges with evidence and witnesses, but noted that over 84% of the cases referred to his office by the Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, were successfully prosecuted. He stressed the need for accountability and consequences for individuals involved in such crimes. Representative Bell wrapped up the discussion by addressing strategies to curb juvenile recidivism. Jackson, an expert on juvenile justice, explained that investing in services for victims of violence, such as mentorship programs, victim services, and community-based initiatives, is key to reducing recidivism rates. However, he pointed out that many of these programs have been underfunded or cut altogether due to budget constraints. Both Bell and Jackson stressed the need to focus on supporting victims while also addressing the root causes of crime through prevention and community-based initiatives. They agreed that law enforcement alone could not solve the problem and that a more comprehensive approach was necessary to ensure long-term public safety. Bell concluded by emphasizing the importance of balancing the needs of victims with those of law enforcement, and the need for adequate funding to support both.